By the end of this story, a drunk who woke up in a stranger's body will burn an entire orc siege camp to the ground, and he will call it Tuesday. Strange wooden ceiling above him. The old man's tears dripped onto the blanket as he explained the raid had come from nowhere, screaming through the tree line at dawn. A wrinkled old face to inches from his own, weeping with relief. 30 guards against an entire raiding party. And every single one of them had known exactly what that math meant going in. My lord, the gods have blessed us. You're awake. Richard forced himself to walk the courtyard slowly, meeting the eyes of every soldier who had watched his father die that morning. Cool, 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 he thought. None of them said it out loud, but he could read the accusation anyway. Where were you, young master, while good men bled for you? Except he had absolutely no idea who this grandfather was. He decided right then that whatever kind of coward the previous owner had been, that particular chapter was officially, permanently closed. The system's stats floated stubbornly in front of his eyes no matter how hard he blinked. The system's troop roster blinked patiently, waiting for him to actually use it instead of just staring at numbers like a frightened tourist. Strength 12, Agility 10, Charisma 8, talent listed simply as lock. 20 Imperial recruits, 400 diners, 5 citizen cavalry, 500 more. And his balance dropped straight into the red instantly. His territory red swaying castle, state of disrepair. Which honestly he could have guessed without any magic screen at all. He laughed once, short and humorless, because apparently going bankrupt was the very first executive decision of his entire noble career. Edwin's voice cracked as he described 30 guards falling by the villagers' time to run. When the gates finally opened and soldiers marched through glowing with faint green light, even the guards on watch dropped to their knees. Real uplifting stuff, Richard thought, staring at broken soldiers leaning silently against the walls. Edwin kept making the sign of the old faith over his own chest, muttering about ancestors and blessings and things beyond his understanding. They watched his father die and could not do a single thing about it. Richard let him believe whatever kept the lice standing, because the alternative explanation involved admitting his soul came from another universe entirely. He dragged himself to the Great Hall and immediately regretted having any hope whatsoever. That night, climbing to the tactical overlook the system had generated in his mind, he studied the enemy camp like a chessboard. This ragged crowd of farmers and boys was supposedly what stood between his people and total annihilation. 2 guards, a scattering of loose tents, and cages holding villagers who had not yet given up hope that someone might come for them. We are doomed, he thought clearly, before Galvin's roar shook the very dust from the ceiling beams. He knocked the first arrow slowly, feeling the bowstring's familiar tension settle into muscles that remembered this motion far better than he did. Fallen, you spineless maggots, the guard captain bellowed, yanking the crying boy upright by his collar. The reticle steadied on the sentry's skull, and for one long breath, the old, drunk, cowardly part of him screamed to run away instead. Grip it tight, he told him, pretend it is the tavern owner's wife's underwear strap. He released anyway, and the arrow found its mark exactly where the ghost light had promised. And the man simply folded without a sound. The whole hall dissolved into laughter, breaking the tension like a snapped bowstring. The second sentry turned at the noise a half-second too late, and the throat shot ended him before his hand ever reached his weapon. Edwin whispered that his father found this lunatic in a place called Blood Gorge, paid for entirely in dwarf whiskey. Double kill, the system chimed. And somewhere behind him a grizzled veteran whispered that no ordinary archer shot like that in the dark. Money well spent, honestly, truly. Galvin seized the moment instantly, inventing an entire ancestral technique on the spot. The swaying falling star, delivered with total conviction. Galvin's bloodshot eye looked like lava in the firelight, as he asked what exactly was running through Richard's veins right now. Wine or blood? Nobody questioned it, because a one-eyed madman insisting something was legendary was apparently more convincing than actual visible proof. Enough blood to paint the Frost Whisper Mountains red, Richard answered, and every soldier in the room felt the shift in the air. Richard set the torch to the grain stores himself, watching flame catch dry husks and spread outward faster than he expected it to. You hear that, maggots? Tonight we use orc intestines for wall mortar, Galvin howled to the crowd. Screaming erupted through the camp almost immediately, and the recoiling firelight turned every panicked orc silhouette into a target he could not miss. Richard pulled Edwin aside privately and asked exactly how much silver remained hidden in the treasury. His 20 recruits advanced behind their shields in a formation that looked clumsy and slow, but somehow never actually broke under pressure. About 300, my lord, but the orcs won't accept ransom, only blood and fire, Edwin admitted. An orc warrior came charging with a raised axe, and one of his soldiers caught the blow on his shield, grunting but holding firm. Bring it all right now, Richard ordered. watching the system convert every last coin into its own strange currency. Richard put an arrow through the attacker's throat before the axe ever came down a second time, and the recruit nodded once, shaken but alive. 800 dinars total, and he had been a lord for roughly 4 hours and was already somehow in debt. A massive elite berserker sent a soldier flying, shield and all, and Richard drew to full tension, feeling the wood groan under the pressure. Truly a born leader of men and finances, he thought bitterly, watching the negative balance blink at him. The berserker threw his head back to roar in triumph, and that open mouth became the single worst decision of his entire violent life. A messenger reported movement outside the walls, and he ran up expecting an attack, finding reinforcements instead. The arrow went in through his throat and stopped somewhere near the base of his skull, and the roar died into a wet, gurgling silence. 20 spearmen and 5 cavalry stood glowing faintly with markers only Richard himself could see. Cavalry hit the collapsing formation from the flank, lances catching torchlight as they punched clean through orc after fleeing orc in sequence. Edwin nearly had a religious experience on the spot, asking if these were old friends of the family. When the last body dropped, the field went unnervingly quiet, just crackling fire and the ragged breathing of men who had somehow survived. He smiled for the first time since waking up in this entire world, and simply ordered the gates thrown open. Every soldier on that hill turned to look at him, standing there with his family bow, looking for all the world like he had a plan. That midnight, the system handed him a top-down tactical map showing every single guard position around the enemy camp. He did not really. Just a magic screen and enough desperation to fake competence convincingly enough that nobody noticed the difference. Only 2 sentries stood watch over the cages full of captured villagers, and neither one had a single chance. Clean up the field, he ordered, keeping his voice level, and tie up any living orcs, because he needed answers more than he needed corpses. He drew the family's heirloom hunting bow, and a ghostly targeting reticle snapped instantly onto the first guard's skull. The victory tally scrolled through his vision: kills, experience, coin, grain. And for one dizzying moment the negative balance simply vanished. The arrow curved through the dark like it had its own navigation system, punching clean through the eye socket. He had gone from unconscious under a wine barrel to standing over a battlefield. He had personally planned and personally survived in one night. The second sentry barely had time to flinch before an arrow buried itself in his throat as well. Morning light made the scorched, half-repaired walls look almost dignified, like a wound that had at least stopped actively bleeding. Archery proficiency unlocked, quick knocking passive gained, and one pockmarked veteran soldier simply muttered that this had to be legend. Edwin's daily report read like a spreadsheet written by someone who genuinely believed the numbers might improve if he just stared hard enough. Galvin jumped on the moment instantly, inventing the legendary swaying falling star arrow technique without a shred of hesitation. 47 refugees needed housing, and every single face in that crowd looked like it had forgotten what a full night's sleep felt like. This man is a walking propaganda machine, and Richard loved every second of it. He gave the order for blankets and porridge without hesitation, and Edwin's expression shifted from doubt to something closer to grudging respect. Step 1 was arson, Step 2 was rescue, Step 3 was pure prayer that the plan actually worked. Being a lord, he was learning fast. Mostly meant making decisions quickly enough that nobody had time to notice you had no idea what came next. The moment the torch touched the grain pile, the entire sky turned orange with panic-screaming orcs. That evening he tested the wall repair function alone on a collapsed section nobody would notice, just to see if the magic screen was lying. His 20 recruits advanced behind wooden shields bristling with spears like an angry hedgehog, learning to walk. Stones lifted themselves silently, stacking into place with nothing but the grinding sound of rock finding its way home. After a long absence, an arrow curved impossibly around a raised shield and found an eye anyway, and physics simply left the conversation entirely. 30 dinars to defy physics quietly in the dark, and he decided that was easily the best purchase he had made since arriving in this world. A massive elite berserker sent one of his recruits flying, shield and all. Before Richard drew his bow to full tension, 12 blank-eyed soldiers stood in perfect rows in the wine cellar, and he upgraded 3 of them just to watch the transformation happen. The berserker threw his head back to roar, and that was exactly the wrong moment to open his mouth wide. Leather dissolved into steel in a flash of light, and the soldiers did not so much as blink through their own equipment changing entirely. Right flank cavalry cut into the collapsing orc formation like a hot knife, through very angry green butter. By dawn the walls stood whole again, and someone in the crowd shouted a nickname that had no business sticking, but stuck anyway instantly. When the very last orc dropped, silence fell across the field like a physical weight settling onto everyone at once. Long live the Starfaller, and within the hour every guard on the wall was repeating it like they had grown up hearing the legend. Inside his head, the victory screen exploded with numbers, kills, experience, coins, grain, all of it flooding in at once. He realized, watching morale numbers tick upward with every repetition, that he was literally gaining combat strength through pure branding alone. He had gone from unconscious in a wine cellar to battlefield commander in the span of a single day. Marketing, apparently, worked exactly the same whether you were selling soap or selling the idea that a drunk hair was secretly a hero. Not bad for a first day in another world, not bad at all, he thought, watching the debt vanish completely. 3 days later, refugees straggled through the morning fog, thin, frostbitten, carrying nothing but what they could drag behind them. Morning light hit the castle walls, almost making the crumbling ruin look pretty under the glow. An old man collapsed at the gate, forehead against frozen stone, begging for shelter in a voice that had clearly given up expecting kindness. This is not a dream, he told himself plainly, staring out at a medieval world that genuinely wanted him dead. Near the back, a tall hooded figure moved differently than the rest, controlled, watchful, the kind of stillness that meant real danger nearby. The system cheerfully displayed food production, tax income, and commerce numbers like a small business dashboard. The system tagged him instantly, a hero unit 15 levels above Richard's own, walking through a refugee line like a sword wearing rags. 47 refugees poured through the gates, most of them looking like ghosts wearing torn rags. I like to check which way doors open first, the stranger said dryly, so I do not hit a wall when I need to run again. Get every blanket from storage, hot water, porridge from the kitchen, he ordered. And Edwin obeyed without argument. Royce Blackblade, former squad commander, currently a homeless stray dog. He introduced himself like reading someone else's obituary aloud for practice. Being a lord had exactly one working perk so far. People actually listened the instant he opened his mouth. 3 meals a day, and a winter you will not have to run through, Richard offered. And the stranger actually laughed, a short, surprised sound. 7 days of food remained according to the system, a number that sat heavy in his stomach the rest of that morning. Smart little eagle deal, Royce said, and the system quietly logged a new hero unit with a loyalty score that was polite at best. 3 cavalrymen dragged in a bound orc missing its left ear, replaced instead with 3 bronze earrings. In the war room the next morning, Royce's finger traced the terrain like a surgeon, immediately flagging the raid's route as deeply unusual. Even tied up like a Christmas hem, the creature kept thrashing, growling, and grinning through jagged, disgusting fangs. Orcs took the wrong pass entirely, he said, tapping a spot that should have led them to a far richer valley town instead. Galvin translated the threat word for word, and the room went cold. 3 days until a warlord wanted his skull as a drinking cup. Then Edwin arrived clutching a strange reddish stone, and the blacksmith's verdict landed like a dropped anvil. This matched nothing local at all. This is fine, everything is fine, Richard told himself, sending the prisoner to the dungeon for treatment instead of execution. Iron, Royce said quietly, the one thing every orc tribe on this continent could never get enough of, no matter how much they already had. Dead prisoners could not talk, and he desperately needed every scrap of information this creature was willing to give. Richard filed the discovery away under problems for a version of himself, who was not currently worried about starving through the coming winter. At noon, the hall filled wall to wall with complaints about wheat fields, charcoal shortages, and crumbling stonework. An envoy from Greystone arrived that same week, admiring the family tapestries like a man pricing them for resale rather than complimenting them. Galvin punched a support wall so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling. In response to every single problem, 50 elite soldiers, permanent garrison duty, he offered, and the generosity felt wrong the second the words left his overly polished mouth. This man's solution to literally everything was violence directed at architecture. And honestly, it was oddly reassuring. The price revealed itself soon enough. Marriage to Lord Horn's niece. A political leash disguised as a wedding gift wrapped in silk ribbon. That evening he walked the battlements alone, watching morale numbers hovered just barely above yesterday's totals. The Schwain family handles its own problems, Richard said, and watched the envoy's smile crack like ice under sudden, unwelcome pressure. He found a hidden, collapsed section of wall on the southeast corner and quietly tested the system's repair function. The invoice left with thin threats about overdue taxes trailing behind him, and Galvin's fist hit the table hard enough to rattle the candles. 30 diners, and the fallen stones lifted themselves silently back into a perfect wall with no sparkle, no glow, nothing. That night, roasted meat and dwarven liquor loosened the captured orc's tongue far more effectively than any threat could have managed alone. just rocks stacking themselves like an invisible mason working overtime through the cold, quiet night. 50 warriors, a mountain camp, a landslide that exposed iron 2 months prior. All of it spilled out between grateful, greedy mouthfuls. Deep in the old wine cellar, 12 system soldiers stood in perfect rows, blank-eyed, motionless, extremely unnerving mannequins. Then Royce burst in with numbers that changed everything. 500 moving toward the mountains. Not raiders, an entire tribe relocating outright. He spent his remaining coin upgrading 3 of them into proper Imperial infantry, watching leather transform into gleaming steel. 48 hours became 0 sometime before dawn, and the horn that woke him was not a drill this time. Not even close. By dawn, villagers stepped outside and simply froze, staring at fortifications that had been crumbling wrecks only hours earlier. He drained his treasury, completely summoning 30 archers who appeared already believing they were an ancient ranger company home from a secret mission. Long live the Starfaller, someone shouted, and the nickname caught fire across the entire population within minutes. Then came catapults, rising through the foundation stones, trailing cobwebs and cellar damp, exactly as convincing as 300 years of storage would suggest. Every soldier who repeated the name gained a small boost to morale, and Richard realized he was literally gaining strength through branding. Edwin's disbelief lasted exactly as long as it took to spot his dead master seal, forged into the gear mechanism, and then it simply stopped. Marketing worked in every single dimension apparently, and he had no plans to stop exploiting that fact. By sunrise, Grol's army crested the horizon like a slow green flood, and the chieftain himself rode to heads above every other orc present. A horn blast on the third morning sent guards scrambling in genuine panic, before revealing itself as nothing more than a drill. His axe still carried Richard's father's dried blood, uncleaned, worn almost like decoration. And something in Richard's chest went very quiet and very cold. Too slow, Galvin screamed at the recruits, warning that orcs would already be drinking from their skulls by now. The first catapult volley found him dodging with impossible grace, an axe thrown mid-roll deflecting the net before it ever reached the ground. Starting today, we are on wartime rations, Richard announced to his gathered squad leaders, and every face turned grim. Are you kidding me? Richard thought, watching a chieftain casually parry siege weaponry like it was an inconvenience, rather than a genuine threat. Then the system delivered a notification that turned his blood instantly cold. Scouts detected in the Frost Whisper Mountains. The gate finally gave way entirely, and the wolf that came through it stood taller than any horse Richard had ever personally seen up close. The main force could arrive in as little as 36 hours, and Chief Grol was already dreaming about his skull. Little whelp, Grol rumbled, promising a drinking cup made from Richard's own skull. And somewhere behind him Frostworn was not yet even forged. Let us see if the Starfaller can survive round 2, he told himself, staring at the mountains like a countdown timer on a bomb. His 3 arrows found flesh, 1 deflected, 1 grazing steel, 1 landing true on an already ruined shoulder that refused to slow him down. Through the morning fog, roughly 20 ragged humans huddled at the gate, exhausted from 3 straight days of running. The axe came down in an arc that would have split him cleanly in half, and he threw himself sideways into stone chips in pain. An old man collapsed forward, forehead striking the cold stone, begging for shelter after orcs destroyed everything he had. Galvin's shield wall took the next impact, shields shattering, the old captain jamming his own shoulder into the breach out of sheer stubborn will. Toward the back of the group, a tall figure hunched over, still towering above everyone else despite the tattered cloak. A sword found the chieftain's throat, shallow, useless, before Grol trapped the blade in his own flesh and swung his free fist toward Richard's chest. A metallic glint flashed briefly beneath the fabric, and Richard's system flagged him instantly as something far above ordinary. The armor absorbed it, barely, leaving a dent shaped like abstract art and a set of ribs that would ache for weeks afterward. Recruitable hero unit, Royce Black Blade, level 15. And Richard was staring at level 2 like an absolute amateur. Spear, then broken spear, weapons cycling through his hands faster than he could properly grip them, each one by in seconds instead of victory. This man was walking through his refugee line like a legendary weapon, wearing a homeless disguise for fun. Galvin's thrown short sword pinned the axe uselessly into stone, and Richard saw the one opening the whole fight had been building toward. Open the gates, he ordered, watching everyone shuffle inside except the one man who mattered most. He drove the broken, pointless half of a shaft forward with every remaining ounce of strength left in his exhausted, trembling body. I like to check which way the doors open first, Royce explained flatly, so I do not hit a wall when I need to run. The chieftain's massive frame hit the ground like a felled tree, staring at the weapon that killed him with something like genuine disbelief. His right hand had not left his hip once this entire conversation, hovering over a hidden short sword the whole time. "Who says you need a sharp edge?" he spat, watching an achievement notification announce reason persuasion, with what felt like genuine system humor. Royce Blackblade, former squad commander of the 3rd Royal Legion. He introduced himself like he was reading his own obituary aloud. The orc line broke completely the moment their leader fell, some fleeing outright, others turning on each other in leaderless, directionless panic. "Currently a homeless stray dog," he added dryly, and the system confirmed every single word of that self-description. By sunset the castle stood barely, and a medic wrapped his wounds while the system quietly patched his health bar back toward full. "The Swain family welcomes capable warriors," Richard said, pausing deliberately, "especially ones familiar with orc tactics specifically." He mounted the war axe above the fireplace, deciding every functioning lord probably needed at least one trophy, to remind people not to test him. His eyes narrowed sharply, asking outright if Richard somehow already knew exactly who he was talking to. Grash's chains rattled against stone as he offered a tribe's future, in exchange for one honest question answered honestly in return. "I know you can help me hold this castle," Richard answered, dodging the actual question with practiced ease. "Submit, and your people survive as warriors, not slaves," Richard told him, and watched a grown warrior kneel like a judge delivering final sentence. "Payment is 3 meals a day, in a winter where you finally do not have to run anymore," he offered plainly. 22 orcs joined that night, alongside a full month of grumbling human soldiers who did not appreciate their new green co-workers whatsoever. Royce actually laughed at that, calling him a smart little eagle before agreeing to the deal on the spot. Ethel arrived without footsteps, examining the axe on the wall with open, aristocratic disdain before revealing she had watched the entire battle unfold. Loyalty sat at 65. A merely acceptable starting number considering he had just saved this man from starving. A bloodstained crest hit the table. Horn's own envoy, spotted leaving the orc camp the very night before the attack had ever begun. Tough crowd indeed, Richard thought, already planning how to earn a little more trust from his newest hero unit. Everything clicked at once: the marriage proposal, the timing, a jealous neighbor engineering a massacre he intended to profit from afterward regardless. In the war room, Royce traced the terrain with the surgeon's precision, immediately flagging something deeply unusual about the attack. "Elves for iron mine oversight," she offered, and Richard agreed instantly, trading nothing real for the finest archers in the entire region. "Orcs usually take a completely different trail," he noted, tapping a pass that led straight to a wealthier river valley town instead. 3 days later, at Bloodclaw Canyon, 200 of Horn's finest marched confidently into a corridor, built entirely to swallow them whole. They went out of their way specifically to hit this territory, which meant there had to be a very specific reason behind it. Boulders sealed the exits, arrows rained from the cliffs, and Horn himself ended up face first in bloody gravel, begging for a ransom nobody offered. Then Edwin burst through the door clutching a strange reddish-brown stone, like it might explode in his own hands. "Collaborating with orcs to attack a noble house," Richard said quietly, "is a charge I simply cannot afford to let slide, Sir Horn." The blacksmith confirmed the composition matched nothing found locally, meaning the orcs had discovered a brand new source somewhere nearby. That single ambush turned a struggling border lord into a genuinely wealthy one, and his ragtag army finally became something worth calling an army. The entire room fell silent, and Royce's eyes lit up like someone had just handed him an early Christmas present. "Iron is the one resource every orc tribe can never possibly get enough of," he explained, connecting the pieces instantly. Richard decided immediately to keep the discovery a closely guarded secret, focusing entirely on survival before wealth. Priorities, he reminded himself. Step 1 was staying alive, and Step 2, getting rich, could not happen as a corpse. An envoy from neighboring Greystone Fortress arrived that same afternoon, admiring the family tapestries like a museum patron. He offered a theatrical, rehearsed condolence for the old Baron's death before pivoting smoothly into cheerful business talk. 50 elite soldiers for permanent garrison duty, the envoy announced. A genuinely generous offer that immediately raised every alarm bell. His spider sense screamed the moment the price finally revealed itself. Marriage to Lord Horn's 17-year-old niece. A political alliance disguised as generosity, designed to slowly turn Richard into nothing more than Horn's obedient puppet. "The Swain family handles its own problems," Richard said slowly, watching the envoy's polite mask crack like thin ice. The envoys, now openly hostile, reminded him coldly about overdue grain taxes before storming out in a fit of wounded pride. "Filthy vulture, trying to rob us while we are still bleeding," Galvin spat, slamming his fist against the war table hard. That night, in the dungeon, Richard tossed a roasted deer leg toward the chained orc, Watching hunger instantly overpower pride. Grash Bloodfang, Bloodscar Tribe, Combat Rating C, currently hostile. The system displayed with clinical, useful precision. He tossed a flask of dwarven liquor next, watching the orc's eyes widen at the smell of something apparently very fine. Loosened by drink, Grash revealed the exact mountain camp location, 50 warriors guarding it, and far more hidden warriors beyond. Then Royce burst into the dungeon with news that stopped everyone completely cold. 500 orcs moving toward these mountains. That was not a raiding party at all. That was an entire tribal migration relocating everything. Women, children, elders, all of it. They found iron in these mountains, and now they intended to move their entire operation here permanently, Royce explained grimly. Before dawn fully broke, urgent pounding hit his door. The main orc force had already reached the ruins of the North Village. 48 hours had somehow collapsed into zero, and it was finally, undeniably, showtime. He shot straight upright, yanking open the system menu before his eyes had even fully adjusted to the darkness. 900 diners for 30 archers, draining his entire treasury completely in one single, desperate purchase. The horn blasted, and 30 archers materialized outside in matching brown leather, quivers packed, crests stamped on every shoulder plate. The system quietly generated a legendary backstory for them on the spot. A ranger company returning from some secret mission. Their captain, Alan Longbow, snapped a perfect salute, and Richard clapped his shoulder like they were old war companions already. Then the notification he had been silently hoping for finally arrived, siege engine summoning. Special permission unlocked, for catapults rose up through the castle's very foundation, dripping cellar moisture. Cobwebs hanging off ancient bronze fittings. Edwin's eyes nearly popped clean out of his skull. Since he had served his family for 30 years and knew no catapults existed, somehow the golden shimmer in Richard's own eyes convinced the old butler to swallow every single question whole anyway. Did you really think a 300-year-old castle would have no emergency measures? Edwin told the stunned soldiers smoothly. The blacksmith gasped, spotting the old lord's personal seal forged directly into the catapult's inner gear mechanism. The system had quietly committed identity fraud on behalf of a dead man, and Richard found that both impressive and terrifying. By sunrise, all four catapults stood loaded and ready, right as the orc army finally appeared on the horizon like a green tide. Chieftain Grill rode a massive black warwolf, the full heads taller than any other orc, scars covering pale green skin. His battle axe still carried old, dried brown bloodstains, and he had never once bothered cleaning off Richard's father's blood. That is very personal, Richard thought, feeling the wooden catapult frame vibrate beneath his fingers with genuine excitement. All four catapults fired in unison, and Grill rolled sideways off his wolf, throwing a hand axe that severed the net's rope midair. Are you kidding me? He thought, watching a chieftain casually parry an entire catapult shot like it was nothing at all. His second catapult still landed perfectly, exploding inside a packed orc formation and sending green limbs in every wrong direction. Grill screamed new orders, and his entire army scattered from tight formation into a much smarter, spread-out wolf pack pattern instantly. Reality's difficulty setting was clearly broken, Richard thought bitterly, wishing desperately for a save file that did not exist. The gate groaned under a battering ram's relentless impact while archers picked off exposed orcs, one precise shot at a time. Then the east gate exploded inward entirely, and the first thing through it was a wolf the size of a full-grown horse. Chieftain Grill rode directly behind it, to broken arrow shafts already jutting uselessly from his heavily bleeding left shoulder. Little whelp, his voice rumbled like gravel dragged slowly across stone, promising to hang Richard's guts from his own war banner. Creative threat, Richard thought, points for pure originality, though heavy deductions for the obvious attempted murder involved. His triple shot split against the chieftain's raised axe, grazed an iron neck guard, and finally landed a critical hit on bare shoulder. The war axe carved a death arc through the air that would have split him cleanly in half, had he not dived sideways instantly. Galvin's shield wall took the next brutal blow, shields shattering under the raw force, yet somehow still holding the line together. Richard switched to his sword, drew first blood across Grill's exposed throat, only to watch the chieftain trap the blade in his own muscle. He abandoned the sword entirely, leaning back in the world's most terrified limbo as an axe scraped across dented chest armor. That armor just saved his entire life, and it now resembled some kind of violent, accidental modern art installation. He grabbed the fallen spear next, carving a gash across Grill's waist before the shaft finally snapped clean in half under pressure. Galvin threw his own short sword in desperation, striking the chieftain's wrist and wedging that massive axe uselessly into solid stone. With the axe trapped, the wrist injured, and the shoulder full of arrows, Richard saw exactly one single opening remain. He grabbed the broken half of his spear, the end without any point at all, and rammed it forward with every last ounce of strength. The bare wooden shaft punched deep into an already ruined shoulder, and the chieftain's massive body finally crashed down like a felled tree. "Who says you need a sharp edge to kill someone?" he spat, staring down at the corpse of a warlord who wanted his skull. Achievement unlocked, reason persuasion, killing an enemy with a blunt weapon. And the system apparently had a genuine sense of humor. The moment Girl died, the entire battlefield broke apart completely, some orcs fleeing outright, others turning berserk on each other instead. By sunset, Snow Eagle Castle stood barely, but it stood, and he sat exhausted on the wall while a medic bandaged his wounds. The final scoreboard glowed inside his mind, hundreds of enemies dead, thousands of experience points, a genuine fortune and loot secured. He mounted the massive war axe above the fireplace in the Great Hall, deciding every proper lord truly needed one trophy displayed. Halfway through the victory feast, Edwin whispered that the orc prisoner in the dungeon wanted an urgent word with him personally. Grash Bloodfang looked up with complicated eyes, chains clinking softly as he shifted his weight against cold stone walls. By tradition, the victor holds the right to decide the fate of the entire defeated tribe: women, children, territory, everything. The system presented three brutal choices: extermination, slavery, or careful integration, each carrying its own specific long-term cost. If given the chance to lead what remains of the Bloodscar clan, what would you choose? Richard asked him directly. "Are you toying with a warrior's dignity?" Grash demanded, every muscle in his massive body going completely taut with tension. "Submit, and your people do not just survive, they survive as warriors still," Richard told him with genuine, quiet conviction. Slowly, painfully, Grash finally dropped to one knee, chains hammering stone like a judge delivering a permanent, binding verdict. "The Bloodscar clan will fight for you," he swore. And 22 new orc warriors joined the army that very night. Walking back into the feast, he noticed every soldier subtly leaning away from a hooded figure standing near the fireplace. Silver hair flowing like liquid mercury beneath the hood, pointed ears, emerald eyes. An actual elf inside his own castle. Ethel of the Silver Pine clan introduced herself, revealing calmly that her people had simply watched the entire battle unfold. As former allies, elven arrows could have saved lives today, Richard said, narrowing his eyes at her casual, detached honesty. "We do not interfere in human conflicts, especially when traitors wear allied masks," she answered without even blinking once. She dropped a blood-stained crest onto the table, unmistakably belonging to Lord Horn's own envoy, spotted leaving the orc camp. Everything clicked together instantly: the marriage proposal, the sudden attack, all of it engineered by a jealous, greedy neighbor. Ethel offered elite archers, armor-piercing arrows, and critical intelligence in exchange for oversight of his new iron mining operation. A trade then, he agreed instantly, gaining the region's finest ranged unit for something that cost him nothing whatsoever. The next morning, in the war room, they laid careful groundwork to lure Horn's forces into a canyon ambush, entirely of their own making. Grash returned to his own camp carrying Grill's massive axe as unquestionable proof of his new, legitimate leadership among the survivors. 3 days later, at Bloodclaw Canyon, 200 of Horn's elite soldiers marched confidently into a trap disguised as easy cleanup work. Boulders sealed both exits the instant the column reached dead center, and 30 archers appeared on the surrounding cliffs above them. Horn himself, sitting comfortably on a warhorse, gave a pompous little speech about justice while his own deputy took an arrow through the throat. "It is the Swain. We have been tricked," Horn screamed, his voice cracking with genuine panic as arrows rained down mercilessly. Orcs charged down the slopes on cue, smashing into what remained of Horn's supposedly elite forces without any mercy whatsoever. Grash personally cleaved Horn's battle flag clean in half, before shoving the trembling lord face first into bloody, frozen gravel. "Collaborating with orcs to attack a noble house is a charge I simply cannot afford to let slide," Richard told him quietly. That single devastating ambush turned an already wealthy young lord into an outright, staggeringly rich one within a single afternoon. His entire ragtag army upgraded overnight, leather turning into proper armor, recruits becoming trained soldiers with real formation discipline. The drunk in the wine cellar had officially left the building for good, and the Starfaller was now firmly open for business. Standing at the exposed iron vein glowing dark red in the morning sun, he pressed his palm against it like greeting an old friend. Standing at the iron vein glowing dark red under morning light, he pressed his palm to the rock like greeting an old, profitable friend. The mine expanded itself instantly, wooden support beams growing out of solid rock like trees running on fast-forward footage. The mine expanded on its own, beams growing like fast-forwarded trees, and every orc worker present went visibly, impressively pale with unease. His orc workers went visibly pale. which was genuinely impressive considering they were already naturally green-skinned to begin with. Self-governing housing over slavery, he decided, because happy workers rarely stab their employers in their sleep. Unlike the alternative he had rejected, he chose self-governing housing over harsher, more efficient options, reasoning that happy workers simply did not stab you in your sleep. Territory Overview delivered its usual gut punch: thousands of mouths, burned fields, barely a month of grain standing between them, and true disaster. Ethel appeared beside him without a single audible footstep, admitting his strange magic left every single tree root completely undisturbed. Tradition demanded a trip south to swear fealty, and 3 days later he rode with 10 cavalry through a longer, grain-rich trade route. On the ride home, he pulled up the full territory overview and immediately, deeply regretted actually looking at those specific numbers. At a bustling river town, a merchant named Marco was mid-crisis, sword drawn against an embezzling subordinate kneeling terrified in the mud. 5,000 humans across 3 struggling villages, plus 350 orcs, and only 31 days of food remaining. Richard bought the man's entire collapsing operation on the spot, that's included, and gained a ruthlessly efficient trade partner within the same afternoon. Edwin reminded him that tradition required a new lord to travel south and personally swear fealty directly to the king himself. Marco exposed a grain seller's blatant markup using nothing but memorized market records, and negotiated the price down before Richard said a single word. 3 days later, 10 cavalry escorted him south, choosing a longer trade route deliberately for the sake of desperately needed grain. By evening they had enough grain for the winter, a river route to his own doorstep, and a merchant already outperforming half his existing staff. At a bustling river town, he discovered a merchant named Marco publicly threatening an embezzling employee. At genuine sword point, the capital's throne room smelled of pine resin and unspoken political calculation. The moment he finally stepped through its enormous, ancient doors, he bought the man's entire collapsing caravan on the spot, that's fully included, gaining a ruthlessly efficient new trade partner instantly. King Augustus announced Horn's execution and the sudden, dangerous vacancy of an entire orc-infested border territory nobody in the room actually wanted. Marco negotiated grain prices down using precise market records, exposing and overcharging merchants' blatant fraud within mere minutes. Silence swallowed the hall, every noble suddenly fascinated by tapestries they had passed 1,000 times, without once actually looking at them. By evening, he had secured enough grain to survive the entire winter, discovered a river route straight to his own front door, and saved a genuine fortune. Richard stepped forward and cited a century-old, forgotten law, and the old king's genuine amusement was the first real reaction all morning. The Starfaller's little kingdom was rapidly diversifying, and he had not even reached the royal capital yet. "Do you understand what taking Greystone truly means?" the king asked plainly, and Richard accepted anyway without hesitation, without flinching once. The throne room reeked of burning pine resin and unspoken political tension. The moment he finally stepped inside, a legendary black blade touched both his shoulders, and he rose a baron of 2 territories, carrying a royal mandate and a debt of blood. King Augustus announced Horn's execution and the sudden, dangerous vacancy of an entire frozen, orc-infested border territory. Monarchy, he decided, walking out of that throne room, was simply a protection racket that happened to wear considerably nicer, heavier hats. Every single noble present suddenly became deeply fascinated by tapestries they had walked past 1,000 times without notice. In the blacksmith district days later, he traded captured orc armor for a grumbling dwarf named Grom and his perpetually drunk apprentice, Grundon. Richard stepped forward and cited a forgotten, century-old law allowing conquerors to inherit the lands of any sworn tribe. A pack of spoiled noble boys mocked his frozen little barony on the road home, sneering about pickled orc meat and 10-year-old potatoes. The old king's eyebrows shot upward with genuine amusement, clearly delighted that someone finally had the courage to actually volunteer. He reminded their leader coldly of the frostbitten nights his father's gold had bought him out of, and watched every ounce of color drain away. "Do you understand what taking Greystone truly means?" the king asked, listing frozen winters, endless bloodshed, and thankless service. The convoy dragged north through deepening snow, absorbing nearly 90 desperate refugees from Horn's abandoned lands along the way. Without a second thought, Richard accepted without a single moment of hesitation, watching the king press a legendary black blade to both of his shoulders. That evening, 30 frost wolves closed in fast, far outside any range where the system could summon a single reinforcement to help him. Effective immediately, the Greystone title is abolished, and its territory falls entirely under Schwing's stewardship, the king declared. He drew his bow, dropping wolf after wolf with clean, Precise shots while grunting crushed skulls with an enthusiasm entirely unbecoming of a scholar. He walked in as a broke, drunken heir and walked out as a baron of 2 entire territories, carrying a genuinely legendary sword. A massive white alpha faked one direction before instantly reversing, revealing genuinely unsettling intelligence for a creature built entirely out of teeth. Monarchy, he decided privately, was basically just a protection racket wearing considerably fancier hats than the ones back home. He baited a full leap deliberately, then drove an arrow straight down its open throat mid-flight, ending the duel before it truly began. 3 days later, in the capital's blacksmith district, he traded captured orc armor for a grumbling dwarfsmith and his drunk apprentice. The pack scattered the instant their leader hit the snow, leaving behind a rare pelt and enough meat for a proper feast that very night. A pack of spoiled noble boys mocked his frozen little barony on the road home, sneering about frozen potatoes and pickled orc meat. Joy around the campfire lasted almost exactly 5 minutes before the village elder reminded him. These extra mouths would not survive until spring. Younger, he said coldly. Do you still dream about those frostbitten nights at Northwind Fortress your father's gold bought you out of? Before dawn, urgent pounding hit his door. 200 fresh orc tracks approaching fast from a direction his defenses had never once considered. His face went paper white, and the carriage rolled on, leaving nothing behind but sputtering, humiliated curses in the frozen dust. He summoned 50 infantry and 30 archers on credit, watching the system charge daily interest like some kind of medieval, predatory loan shark. The convoy dragged north through deepening snow, absorbing nearly 90 desperate refugees from Horn's former, now abandoned lands. The village transformed into a fortress within hours, his budget soldiers holding a desperate, buckling line against numbers that should have overwhelmed them completely. That evening, a pack of nearly 30 frost wolves closed in fast. Far outside the range of any settlement, he could summon reinforcements from. A silver arrow saved his collapsing sniper tower at the very last second, Ethel arriving with her usual, infuriatingly perfect sense of timing. He drew his bow, dropping wolf after wolf with clean, precise shots while grunting crushed skulls with pure, drunken enthusiasm beside him. Grash arrived moments later with 50 warriors of his own, smashing into the invading orcs without a single flicker of hesitation between them. A massive white alpha wolf faked one direction before instantly reversing, revealing genuinely unsettling intelligence for a simple animal. Battanian archers dropped their bows for great swords mid-battle, revealing themselves as terrifyingly capable melee fighters nobody on either side had anticipated. He deliberately baited it into a full leap, then drove an arrow straight down its open throat mid-flight, ending the fight instantly. By nightfall the most unlikely dinner followed, humans, elves, and orcs sharing roasted meat around the same fire without a single drawn weapon. The pack scattered the moment their leader hit the snow, leaving behind a rare pelt and enough meat for a proper feast that night. Back at Snow Eagle Castle, Royce had transformed the defenses entirely, layered warning systems stretching all the way to the distant mountain passes. Joy around the campfire lasted almost exactly 5 minutes before the village elder reminded him. These extra mouths could not survive spring. Marco revealed 6 iron deposits buried across the newly inherited territory, one labeled simply as refined or worth triple the standard market rate. Before dawn, urgent pounding hit his door. Cavalry scouts had spotted 200 orc tracks approaching fast from Greystone's direction, riding into Greystone Fortress. An old steward stalled desperately before finally leading him down into a treasury that was almost insultingly empty. This was an entirely different, hostile tribe, and they were heading straight for a village packed full of refugees and children. The system map revealed a hidden passage the man clearly hoped nobody would ever find, and one carefully placed tap exposed a secret vault entirely. He summoned 50 infantry and 30 archers on credit, watching the system charge him daily interest like some kind of medieval loan shark. Strange, blood-red ingots pulse faintly under torchlight, an alloy harder and tougher than anything documented anywhere in this entire known world. The village transformed into a fortified position within hours, and his budget soldiers held a desperate, buckling line against superior numbers. Account books detailed horrifying crimes, weapons for slaves, bribed patrols, and finally, a signed agreement between Horn and Chieftain Grull to attack his home. Just as his sniper tower threatened to finally collapse, a silver arrow saved him at the last possible second, Ethel arriving in perfect timing. Then the letter that changed everything. Proof a member of the royal family had orchestrated his father's murder, using Horn as a disposable tool. Moments later, Grash arrived with 50 warriors of his own, smashing directly into the invading orcs without a single moment of hesitation. Richard burned it without hesitation, choosing patience over a suicidal accusation against the crown that would have ended his family's story permanently. Ethel's archers dropped their bows for great swords mid-battle, revealing themselves as terrifyingly capable melee fighters no one expected. He freed every enslaved miner immediately, converting them into paid contract workers with an honest path towards citizenship. After 5 years of service, by the time the fighting ended, the most unlikely dinner party in this entire world's history followed: humans, elves, and orcs sharing meat. That evening, he crafted the long game, official crime sent openly, a blood-steel sample smuggled quietly, giving the king every reason to reward him. Back at Snow Eagle Castle, Royce had transformed the defenses entirely during his absence. Layered warning systems stretching to the mountain passes. News of the metal reached Grundon almost instantly, and the perpetually drunk dwarf sobered up completely within seconds, sprinting toward the capital immediately. Marco revealed 6 iron deposits buried across the newly inherited territory, one labeled simply as refined or worth triple normal value. Days later, Master Smith Graham arrived, gruff and deeply suspicious, until he recognized the legendary furnace core lost to his people for 2 centuries. Riding into Greystone Fortress, an old steward desperately stalled before finally leading him down into an empty, humiliatingly bare treasury. His system map revealed a hidden passage the old man clearly hoped nobody would ever find, and a single tap exposed a secret vault. Strange, blood-red metal ingots pulse faintly under torchlight, an unknown alloy far harder and tougher than anything known in this world. Buried among the ingots sat account books detailing horrifying crimes, and finally, a letter proving a member of the royal family ordered everything. His own father had died because he discovered this exact operation, and intended to report it directly to the crown itself. Richard burned the letter without hesitation, choosing patience and quiet leverage over immediate, suicidal revenge against the entire throne. He freed every enslaved miner immediately, converting them into paid contract workers with an actual path toward full citizenship someday. That evening, he crafted a careful political play, secretly smuggling a blood-steel sample to the king alongside Horn's documented crimes. News of the strange metal reached Grundon almost instantly, and the perpetually drunk dwarf sobered up completely within seconds flat. Days later, Master Smith Graham arrived in person, gruff and deeply suspicious until he recognized the legendary furnace core lost for centuries. 3 days and nights of non-stop hammering followed, and a crimson blade finally emerged, covered in glowing runes pulsing like a heartbeat. He sealed the weapon with 3 drops of his own blood, and the sword accepted its name, Frostworn, bound to grow stronger with him. Algernon Whittle arrived first, refined gray hair slicked back, a golden quill badge gleaming on his chest. By the king's command, we are here to commend your achievements, the special envoy announced with a graceful, practiced bow. Behind him, Knight Captain Redmond let out a cold snort, full steel plate armor, visor down, eyes cataloging every corner of the hall. A quiet finance officer named Lyons stood at the back like a human shadow, already mentally appraising the value of everything he saw. The king grants hereditary ownership of Greystone territory, with a 3-year tax exemption and 5,000 gold in annual funding, Algernon declared. Redmond stepped forward, iron boots scraping marble, asking how exactly a border lord built such an elite force in mere months. That weapon on your hip, might I have a closer look? The knight demanded, and the entire hall dropped into stunned, freezing silence. In noble etiquette, that request was nothing less than a direct challenge, a glove thrown squarely in Richard's face. My blade does not leave its sheath without tasting blood, Sir Knight, he answered, watching Frostworn's runes begin to flow beneath his palm. Then let it taste, Redmond snapped, his visor clicking shut with a metallic finality that echoed across the marble floor. The training yard filled with silent onlookers, castle guards on one side, royal knights on the other, tension thick enough to chew. Redmond swapped his heavy plate for chainmail, gripping a 2-handed greatsword that gleamed like it wanted to introduce itself violently. By warrior's blood as witness, when victory is decided, stop immediately, Algernon announced, planting his staff firmly between them both. Redmond attacked first, his greatsword falling like a collapsing building, and Richard sidestepped before Frostworn jabbed toward exposed ribs. Sparks flew when the blades finally met, actual sparks, not the metaphorical kind poets like to write about in old songs. The great sword began leaving faint after images in the air, some kind of enchantment woven directly into the knight's expensive gear. Richard deliberately opened a gap in his own defense, bait, and Redmond took it, committing fully to a devastating horizontal sweep. He ducked beneath the blade, close enough to feel it trim his hair, and Frostworn kissed the overextended knight's exposed thigh. No blood came out of the wound at all, because Frostworn drank it instead, pulling warmth up through the hilt into Richard's own hand. Even worse for Redmond, the wound simply would not close, its edges turning a sickly grayish white that refused every attempt to heal. Dark magic, You dare use forbidden sorcery? Redmond roared, and Richard did not bother answering, simply kept attacking without pause. Redmond's defense started cracking visibly, his chainmail collecting fresh gashes the way a bad review collects 1-star ratings online. Then the knight pulled something genuinely dirty, pretending to stumble backward before whipping a hidden dagger from his boot instead. The blade sliced Richard's cheek open, blood running down his jaw and dripping onto Frostwarren's crimson, hungry, waiting surface. Blood rage triggered, attack speed climbing 20% for 30 full seconds. Because he had just fed his own sword his own blood. What followed was 30 seconds of absolute violence. Frostwarren becoming a crimson lightning bolt moving faster than thought itself. Redmond went fully defensive, his great sword humming from constant impacts, his footwork slowly collapsing under the relentless pressure. Then his balance finally broke for half a second. And half a second was every single thing Frostwarren ever needed to end it. The crimson blade came down with everything Richard had, cutting through forged steel like the metal was made of nothing but cheese. The broken blade kept traveling, straight into Redmond's right arm just below the elbow, and bones snapped audibly across the silent yard. The knight knelt in the frozen dirt, minus one arm, breathing like a dying bellows. His career and his secret finally both over. Go tell your master, northern swords are made for cutting paws that reach afar, Richard told him, sheathing his blade slowly. Algernon immediately waved medics forward, then pulled Richard aside for a private word, producing a letter bearing the royal seal. The North needs a new guardian, the letter read, short, loaded, and unmistakably royal in its careful, deliberate implication. His Majesty hopes you will share the fruits of your forge, Algernon said, glancing meaningfully toward the workshop across the courtyard. Say 10 blood-steel swords per year, he proposed, and Richard recognized the transaction instantly. Protection disguised as loyalty. Please thank His Majesty for his trust, Richard answered carefully, already planning to keep his true production numbers hidden entirely. Inside the forge, Graham was pounding a glowing ingot, sparks flying like furious fireflies, muttering that royal envoys were not fit for circus tickets. The sword exists because of exactly 3 things: the furnace heart, frost iron essence, and true dwarven rune craft, the old dwarf explained. Grundon offered up his own blue crystals like sacred artifacts, only for Graham to dismiss them as decent, but nowhere near good enough. Graham pulled a small iron box from his own belt, revealing 3 deep blue crystals radiating cold like tiny portable winters. When the first blood-steel ingot hit the furnace, the blood-red veins across its surface actually started pulsing like a living heartbeat. See that? Graham's voice cracked with genuine emotion, watching the furnace flame shift smoothly from ordinary orange into deep, magical blue. 3 days and 3 nights of non-stop hammering followed, runes blazing red with every single blow across the glowing, singing metal. The patterns did not simply reshape under the hammer, they reorganized themselves entirely, as if the blade itself were slowly waking up. On the 4th day, Graham slumped against the forging table, his rune hammer shattered into pieces, wearing the most satisfied smile imaginable. It is done, he whispered, first one in 300 years, staring at a crimson sword covered in moving, breathing golden runes. As Richard leaned closer, the runes glowed brighter still, recognizing him instantly, responding to his very presence in the room. Needs the Lord's blood, Graham said, handing over a delicate silver knife. 3 drops on the rune convergence point, nothing more. He sliced his palm open without a shred of hesitation, and 3 drops of blood struck the blade in perfect, deliberate succession. The golden runes erupted in red light, the sword pulsing in his hand like a genuine second heartbeat beneath his own skin. Now give it a name, the old dwarf rasped. Choose wisely, since this name binds to the blade forever. And to you as well. Frostwarren, he said finally, and the runes flashed once in acceptance before settling into a steady, warm, contented glow. The wine cellar drunk now held a living, breathing, blood-drinking legendary sword forged in a volcanic furnace beneath his own castle. War horns shattered the morning stillness weeks later, black smoke columns rising over Snow Eagle Castle carrying one unmistakable warning. Scout alert, Orc tribal army 1,200 strong, threat level extreme, direction, straight towards Snow Eagle Castle itself. Not 200 like before. 6 times the force that had already nearly broken his village defenses in a single previous night. He deliberately spread false rumors of hidden siege weapons through his own ranks, knowing the captured spy would smuggle that lie outward. 2 birds, 1 lie, morale boost for his own soldiers, and dangerous disinformation planted directly inside the enemy's own intelligence network. That night, Ethel materialized at his window, snow crystals still clinging to her silver hair, delivering news that made his blood run cold. The Blood Spear tribe did not come alone, she said, spotting human guides embedded directly within the marching orc columns themselves. Worse still, They brought 3 professional counterweight trebuchets, actual military-grade siege weapons capable of eventually cracking his walls open. Deep in the dungeon, Redmond crept toward a captured orc cell, offering a stolen chieftain's token in exchange for coordinated sabotage. When the siege begins tomorrow night, create chaos inside the castle, sabotage the defenses. The disgraced knight whispered through iron bars. I am afraid you will be disappointed, a cold voice answered from the shadows. Ethel appearing with an arrow already aimed at his throat. Torches on both sides of the corridor blazed to full brightness, revealing Richard, Algernon Royce, and a full ring of waiting guards. Redmond's face went white as fresh snow, his one hand grasping for an empty scabbard, since Grash had already taken his sword through the bars. In the king's name, I declare you guilty of high treason, Algernon announced, his staff cracking hard against the cold stone floor. Redmond's face twisted into something almost inhuman, driving a hidden dagger not toward any of them, but straight toward his own throat. An elven arrow knocked the dagger spinning harmlessly away, sparks illuminating his desperate, cornered, utterly trapped eyes in the torchlight. Who provided the trebuchets? Richard demanded, pressing Frostworn's tip gently against the knight's exposed, trembling throat in the darkness. The knight captain smiled a genuinely creepy smile, promising Richard would never guess. Right before black blood began leaking from his mouth. Poison, Royce shouted, grabbing his jaw uselessly. But Redmond was already dead before he finished his own dramatic, theatrical exit line. Grash handed over the wolf-tooth necklace through the bars. Blood-speared chieftain Kalog's personal token, now fully in Richard's possession. A dead spy, physical proof of a prince's own treason, and an enemy chieftain's identification. All secured in a single devastating night. Algernon left within the hour, racing toward the capital with a corpse, a treason file, and enough political ammunition to shake the entire throne. Meanwhile, Richard had a chieftain's token in his pocket, 1,200 orcs at his doorstep, and roughly 24 hours to plan. Current diners, 50,572, including the king's border defense funding freshly delivered by royal courier. First time since arriving in this world that I have more money than I can physically spend, he muttered, staring at the balance. 100 imperial recruits, 50 infantry, 50 archers, 30 cavalry, all materializing at once across the castle's outer field. Gods above, an old soldier whispered, making holy signs across his own chest. The Lord summoned the swaying ancient allies again. That midnight, the strangest convoy in this world's military history slipped out a side gate. 20 orc warriors pushing 3 covered carts. Grash stepped forward at the perimeter, flashing the stolen wolf-tooth necklace, snarling that Chieftain Kalog's gift had finally arrived at last. Under the canvas sat not siege parts, but clay jars of fire oil, disguised as trebuchet components right beneath the enemy's own nose. Deeper in the camp, 3 massive trebuchets stood parked carelessly right beside their own stockpile of flammable oil. For the taking. They basically pre-arranged their own destruction, Richard thought, watching Grash's torches light every single wick in perfect coordination. The western camp erupted on cue, Ethel's elven whistle piercing the night sky. Green magic light blooming false chaos on the horizon. 20 torches flew simultaneously, and 3 trebuchets became 3 pillars of fire shooting straight up into the terrified midnight sky. The flames reached the stored oil jars' necks, one explosion after another, like the world's most destructive fireworks display. The retreat route had already flooded with orcs drawn by the explosions, and Richard drew Frostworn, its blades singing in the cold air. The first orc grabbed his own throat and dropped instantly, blood freezing on the snow before it even finished pooling beneath him. A javelin scraped through a gap in his armor, slicing his left arm, and Frostworn immediately began sipping blood to compensate. A shadow the size of a building blocked their escape route entirely, a frost wolf 3 meters tall. Chieftain Kalog riding proudly atop it. Human insect, his voice ground like continental plates shifting. Hoisting a massive double-bladed axe far larger than any Richard had faced. An arrow wrapped in silver light shot from the treetops, burying itself deep in the giant wolf's eye, and the beast reared back screaming. Run, Richard roared, and the cavalry tore through the gap in the orc line while Kalog's furious scream shook the entire forest behind them. The drawbridge slammed shut behind them, and only then did his left arm finally start burning like someone had poured hot coals inside. War horns blared from the wall almost immediately, the entire orc army moving now, humiliated, furious, and finally coming for the castle directly. Battle stations, his voice echoed into the freezing night, and 200 fresh soldiers stood ready across the walls and courtyard below. Enemy count 1,200 blood spear orcs, his forces 200 infantry, 100 archers, 40 battalion bows, 80 orc allies. He positioned himself beside the western catapult, his favorite toy, the exact spot where physics finally met open, gleeful arson. For catapults fired simultaneously, streaking across the night sky like angry comets before blooming into flowers made of pure fire and death. Firelight illuminated a sea of snarling orc faces, every single one carrying 3, or for throwing spears, standardized blood spear equipment. Now the name finally made sense, he thought, watching the second volley drop directly onto 3 separate siege ladders at once. Orcs on the ladders caught fire immediately, 2 of them fully engulfed but still charging forward until wall archers turned them into pin cushions. Hundreds of short, thick javelins rose from the orc formation like a swarm of locusts, serrated tips trailing blood-soaked cloth streamers. Thunk, 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 javelins hammered the battlements like deadly hail, punching straight through stone cover that should have stopped them completely. Switch to grape shot, he screamed, and thousands of iron nails and rock fragments sprayed out in a fan pattern like violent sprinklers. The Battanian archers specifically targeted orcs reloading their javelins, every single arrow finding a throat or an eye socket without fail. The first orc head popped over the battlements, and Richard split it open with Frostworn before the creature even finished blinking once. Blood drink triggered, healing him steadily as he personally hurled a firebomb over the edge onto a ladder's exposed wooden base. Sticky flames crawled up the ladder like burning snakes, and 6 orcs still climbing became human. Orc torches within seconds. He kicked over a barrel of fire oil next, black liquid pooling around the ladder's base before a single torch turned it into a wall of flame. 30+ ladders eventually burned at once, orcs falling off like flaming rain, the smell of charred meat filling the freezing air entirely. The gate finally groaned under a relentless battering ram, 20 orcs shoving an iron-banded trunk against splintering wood again and again. A dozen fire arrows rained down simultaneously onto the ram crew, and they became a bonfire, screaming, running, and finally, mercifully done. The orc retreat horn finally sounded, and Richard slumped against the battlements completely drained, staring at a field carpeted in orc bodies. 487 orc warriors killed in a single night, and this time, remarkably, he had not gone into a single coin of debt. Morning brought grim math from Royce. Roughly 600 orcs remained regrouped near the ruined North Village, still dangerous despite the losses. Ethel confirmed the enemy was already calling for reinforcements from deeper mountain tribes, buying them perhaps 3 precious days at most. Then, against every reasonable expectation, a royal banner finally appeared at the gate, the king's own 3rd Regiment arriving to reinforce him. The main border force had been deliberately redirected west by the treacherous prince, but this regiment came secretly under Algernon's own orders. In the war room, they finalized a decisive plan. Frontal assault to pin the enemy, while cavalry sealed every single possible escape route. The target remained singular and absolute: kill Chieftain Kalag, and watch the entire remaining tribe collapse completely behind him for good. At dawn, 50 frostwolves launched across the open snowfield, each one a 2-meter killing machine moving at full racehorse speed. Shields, every kite shield slammed into the snow, and the formation became a steel turtle absorbing an entire storm of thrown javelins. 300 steel javelins answered in return, and the front of the charging wolf pack simply disintegrated under the disciplined counter-volley. The main orc force finally charged in a berserk, disorganized rage, and disciplined arrow volleys shattered their front ranks before the lines even met. Richard led his personal guard straight into the melee, Frostworn blazing crimson with every single kill, healing him faster than he could bleed. Through the smoke and screaming chaos, he finally spotted Kalag's banner standing firm and patient in the enemy's undisturbed rear guard. The appetizer round was over, the main course had finally arrived, and Frostworn remained hungry for exactly one more perfect, decisive kill. He broke from the shield wall entirely alone, cutting a path of frozen blood through collapsing orc lines toward that single waiting banner. Kalag turned to meet him with a grin full of broken fangs, hefting a massive war axe like it weighed absolutely nothing at all. Richard drove Frostworn forward, and the blade sang the instant steel finally met steel, scattering sparks across the blood-stained frozen snow. A javelin grazed his shoulder, and the sword pulsed warm immediately, siphoning the pain away almost as quickly as it had ever arrived. He baited an overextended swing, ducked beneath the axe entirely, and drove the crimson blade straight through a gap in Kalag's exposed ribs. Frostworn refused to let the wound heal at all, and Kalag roared, swinging wildly now. More wounded animal than disciplined warrior chieftain, Richard sidestepped the final desperate blow, and finished the fight with one clean strike across the throat, ending it completely and for good. The chieftain's massive body finally hit the snow, and the surrounding orc ranks broke apart the instant their leader collapsed before them. Quest complete, Chieftain Kalag eliminated, and the remaining tribes scattered into the mountains, leaderless, broken, and no longer any threat at all. He looked down at Frostworn, its runes dimming to a soft, satisfied glow, and finally, for the first time, let himself feel at peace. Snow kept falling over the castle like the sky itself could not decide whether to be merciful or cruel that particular week. Somewhere below, a dog barked at nothing, and a soldier told it to shut up in 3 different, increasingly creative languages. The wine cellar sat empty and locked now. A museum piece dedicated to the worst decision the previous owner ever made in his life. Every torch in the great hall guttered at once when the wind found a crack in the shutters. Nobody had gotten around to fixing yet. He caught his own reflection in a polished shield and barely recognized the tired, calculating stranger staring back at him from the metal. Somewhere in the kitchens, someone was arguing about whether porridge counted as a proper breakfast or a punishment disguised as food. The system's interface never blinked, never apologized, never once acknowledged that a human being was slowly losing his mind behind it. Frost crept across the window glass in slow, deliberate patterns, like the world outside was practicing its handwriting before winter fully arrived. A guard on night watch hummed an old tune under his breath, the kind of song men sang to remind themselves they were still alive. Somewhere past the walls, wolves called to each other across the dark, and nobody in the castle slept quite as soundly that night. He rubbed the bowstring callus on his finger constantly now, a nervous habit inherited from a body that remembered were better than he did. The great hall smelled permanently of wood smoke and boiled cabbage, an aroma he decided was the true, unglamorous scent of medieval nobility. Edwin aged visibly with every passing week, though whether from stress or simple time, Richard genuinely could not say for certain anymore. Galvin's laugh could be heard through 3 stone walls, usually at someone else's expense, occasionally at his own, always at full volume. The refugees slowly stopped flinching every time a door slammed, which felt like the smallest, quietest kind of victory imaginable. Somewhere in the barracks, 2 soldiers argued over dice while a third pretended not to be losing badly at the exact same game. He learned to read the castle's moods through its noises. Hammering meant progress, silence meant trouble, and screaming usually meant both at once. The forge chimney became a permanent fixture on the horizon, a thin gray thread of smoke that never quite stopped rising anymore. Children who had arrived starving and silent were now loud enough to be genuinely annoying, which he decided was another quiet kind of victory. Marco's ledgers multiplied by the week, stacked in neat towers that somehow always balanced no matter how chaotic the actual finances felt. Ethel never once knocked on a door in her entire time at the castle, and nobody had the courage to ask her why not. Grundon's goat developed a habit of eating important documents, and nobody quite trusted themselves to confront a dwarf about disciplining his own livestock. The system never once thanked him for anything, which felt somehow appropriate for a piece of software running his entire feudal existence. Winter light through the tower windows turned everything pale gold for exactly 1 hour each morning, and he tried never to miss it. He kept a mental list of things he never expected to know, like orc dialect, bloodsteel purity percentages, and dwarven drinking songs. Frostworn hummed faintly whenever violence was near, a warmth against his hip that he had stopped finding strange weeks ago. Somewhere in the mine, orc laborers sang work songs in a language the human overseers had slowly, grudgingly learned to hum along with. The castle bell rang for meals now instead of emergencies, a small shift that meant more to the villagers than anyone said out loud. He noticed the guards saluting a half-second faster than they used to, the kind of respect that could not be bought with coin. Royce trained recruits until well past dark most nights, insisting exhaustion built better instincts than any amount of theoretical instruction ever could. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in a steady rhythm that Richard eventually realized he had memorized without ever trying to. A single crow perched on the battlements most mornings, and the guards had taken to calling it the castle's unofficial second lord. He wondered sometimes what the original Richard would think of all this, then decided that man had forfeited his opinion the day he hid in a barrel. The refugees planted a small garden behind the east wall in defiance of the season, insisting something green belonged in this frozen place. Grom cursed in Dwarvish so consistently that half the castle staff had picked up a working vocabulary of insults without meaning to. The war room's candles burned lower each week as the maps grew more crowded with markers, arrows, and increasingly specific worry. He started sleeping in his boots most nights, a habit that said everything about the kind of peace this territory actually offered him. Somewhere in the mess hall, someone had started a betting pool on how long the current calm would actually last this time. Ethel's rangers moved through the tree lines so silently that guards occasionally reported ghosts, before realizing it was simply elves on patrol. The castle's population doubled within 2 months, and the system's daily reports grew correspondingly longer, denser, and more exhausting to read. He caught himself calculating troop cost in his sleep once, and decided that was either dedication or a genuine cry for help. Snow Eagle emblem banners appeared in windows across every village he controlled, stitched by hand, without anyone ever ordering it done. The orcs under Grash's command built their longhouses in careful rows, a small green suburb humming with its own strange, orderly rhythm. He learned that dwarves considered silence between hammer strikes to be a form of active insult toward the metal itself. A soldier asked him once, half joking, if the Starfaller ever slept, and he genuinely was not sure how honestly to answer that question. The mountains stayed white and silent for exactly 11 days, before the next piece of bad news inevitably arrived to ruin the peace. He kept Frostworn within arm's reach even during meals now, a habit that said more about this world than any speech ever could. Marco's trade caravans began returning with goods nobody in the north had seen in years: spices, dyed cloth, actual working glass windows. The villagers stopped calling him young master entirely, switching without ceremony to a title that actually fit the man standing in front of them. Baron, they called him now. He still was not entirely used to hearing it. Somewhere below the castle, the geothermal furnace hummed constantly now, a low vibration that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Refugees who arrived skeletal in autumn looked almost unrecognizable by midwinter, and he decided that transformation mattered more than any battle he had won. The soldiers stopped flinching at the sight of orcs patrolling alongside them, though it had taken considerably longer than anyone liked to admit. He caught Royce actually smiling once, briefly watching a training drill go unexpectedly well, and decided not to mention it out loud. Grundon's snoring could reportedly be heard from 2 floors away, a fact the entire castle staff had unfortunately verified independently. The library, such as it was, gained its first new book in decades, a trade ledger Marco insisted counted as essential reading material. He found himself missing absolutely nothing about his old life, a realization that arrived quietly and stayed longer than he expected it to. The forge's blue flame reflected off the underground walls at night, painting the whole workshop in shifting, restless, patient light. Somewhere in the mountains, surviving orc tribes had started telling stories about a human lord who fought with a screaming crimson blade. He did not know that yet, but Frostworn somehow seemed to. Winter deepened, and so did everything else. The walls, the alliances, the debts finally paid off. The quiet, growing shape of something real. The Starfaller was no longer a joke Galvin had invented on the spot to calm a terrified boy, holding his first dagger. It was simply his name now, earn one impossible battle at a time, whether he had ever actually wanted it or not. He stood on the wall some nights just to feel the cold, a small, deliberate reminder that all of this was undeniably, permanently real. Somewhere behind him, the castle breathed, forges humming, soldiers training, children laughing, a kingdom quietly assembling itself out of pure stubborn will. And somewhere out in the dark mountains, more threats were already gathering, because peace in this world never lasted quite long enough. He knew that much already. He was ready for it. Frostworn hummed once against his hip, patient, hungry, and entirely, permanently his. The first time he summoned troops, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the mental menu entirely out of pure disbelief. By the 10th time, he barely blinked, scrolling through unique costs the way other men checked the weather before stepping outside. Edwin developed a specific facial expression reserved only for moments, when soldiers materialized out of thin air in front of witnesses. It was a look somewhere between reverence and quiet, exhausted acceptance that his entire understanding of the world had simply stopped applying. Galvin never once asked where the ancient allies actually came from, deciding some mysteries were better honored than investigated too closely. The villagers had their own theories whispered over dinner, involving old gods, forgotten pacts, and a bloodline more powerful than anyone previously suspected. None of them were remotely close to correct, and Richard intended to keep it that way for as long as humanly possible. He kept the system menu private in every possible sense, never once explaining it, never once letting the glow show at the wrong moment. Frostworn's crimson light was easier to explain away as enchantment, a story people accepted because the alternative sounded genuinely insane. He practiced his cover stories the way other men practice swordplay, refining the lies until they sounded almost boringly plausible. Being a good liar, he decided, was every bit as important to survival here as being a decent shot with a hunting bow. The soldiers who fought beside him twice never asked why their wounds healed faster than anyone else's, choosing gratitude over curiosity instead. He let them believe in blessings, ancestors, divine favor, anything except the actual, ridiculous truth sitting quietly behind his own eyes. Some nights the weight of every secret pressed down harder than any orc axe ever had, and those were the nights sleep refused to come. He thought about his father more than he expected to, a man he had never actually met, yet somehow still owed everything. Guilt from a stranger's cowardice sat strangely in his own chest. Inherited debt paid in blood on behalf of someone he never knew. He decided eventually that motive mattered less than outcome, and outcome, so far, meant the castle still standing against impossible odds. The refugees called him lucky, the soldiers called him blessed, and only he knew luck had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Numbers, he thought. Numbers, a nerve and a system that never once cared whether he deserved any of the power it handed him. He wondered occasionally what would happen if the system simply stopped working one day, then decided that thought was best left unexamined. Every victory bought him another few weeks of peace, and every few weeks of peace bought him time to prepare for the next disaster. The mountains never stayed quiet for long, a lesson the entire territory had learned the hard way. Over and over, since the very beginning, he kept a private tally of every soldier lost under his command, a number he refused to let the system's cheerful notifications erase. Grief moved differently through a body that had not originally owned these memories. Distant but sharp, like pain felt through thick, borrowed gloves. He mourned anyway, quietly, on his own schedule, in whatever spare minutes a besieged border lord could actually claim for himself. The forge never fully went cold anymore, day or night, a heartbeat beneath the castle that matched his own increasingly restless one. Graham complained constantly about human patience, human hands, and human inability to appreciate proper metallurgy, yet never once asked to leave. Grundon's drinking slowed considerably once actual responsibility landed on his shoulders, though nobody dared say that observation out loud near him. The dwarf apprentice took to smithing with a focus that surprised everyone except, apparently, his own gruff, endlessly proud teacher. Marco's trade route stretched further south each month, carrying blood-steel tools disguised carefully as ordinary, unremarkable frontier goods. Nobody outside the territory knew the full scale of what Snow Eagle Castle was quietly becoming, and Richard preferred it stay that way. Power built in silence, he decided, lasted considerably longer than power announced early to enemies, who had not yet earned the warning. Ethel checked on the mine twice a week, precise as clockwork, and left each time with the same faintly approving, unreadable expression. The elves never fully trusted humans, she reminded him once, but trust, apparently, was negotiable when the deal remained sufficiently profitable. He respected that honesty more than any flowery promise of eternal friendship another lord might have offered him under similar circumstances. Royce ran the garrison like a man who had seen exactly what happened to territories that grew comfortable too quickly after victory. Discipline first, he told every new recruit, because comfort gets good soldiers killed faster than any orc axe ever manages to. Richard adopted that philosophy without argument, watching his own instincts sharpen the same way his soldiers' formation slowly, steadily tightened. He was no longer the man who woke up hungover under a strange wooden ceiling, though some days that memory felt uncomfortably close. The castle itself had changed too, scars healed into stronger stone, courtyards busier, walls taller, the whole place slowly earning its reputation. Snow Eagle Castle, once a crumbling relic nobody wanted, was becoming something enemies genuinely thought twice about before approaching carelessly. He liked that shift more than he expected to, watching fear transform slowly into respect across every border report that crossed his desk. The system tracked all of it, coldly, efficiently. Numbers rising in columns that meant nothing to anyone except the man reading them alone. He stopped needing the menu's reassurance eventually, trusting his own judgment more than the glowing text floating quietly behind his own eyes. That felt like real growth, the kind no notification could properly measure, no matter how many experience points it tried to assign. Still, some nights, staring at Frostwyrn's dimmed runes, he wondered how much of this success was truly his, and how much belonged to a game. He decided, in the end, that the distinction mattered less than the people currently alive because of choices he had personally made anyway. A dead system was still a tool, and tools did not swing swords, plan ambushes, or bury the friends lost along the way. That part, at least, was entirely his own for better or worse. In a world that had never once asked his permission to keep him, he accepted the burden fully now, without the panic of that first terrifying morning, without the desperate scramble of a man simply trying to survive. This was his territory now. His people, all of them. His war, whether he had chosen it or not, and he intended to win every single remaining piece of it. Somewhere far to the south, in a capital he rarely thought about anymore, a prince nursed his own quiet, patient grudge against a border baron. Richard knew that thread was not finished, not truly. No matter how many orc chieftains fell beneath Frostwyrn's hungry, glowing blade, he filed that worry away carefully, the same way he filed every other threat, patient, methodical. ready whenever the moment finally arrived. For now, the mountains were quiet, the forge was warm, and the castle, against every reasonable expectation, was genuinely, stubbornly still standing. That would have to be enough, at least for tonight. At least until the next horn sounded across those endless frozen peaks. And in this world, he had learned that horn always sounded again eventually, sooner than anyone standing on the wall ever truly hoped. He was ready for it anyway. Snow Eagle Castle held one impossible night at a time, one debt repaid, one orc tribe broken, one legendary blade sharpened further still. The Starfaller stood watch, and for the first time since a strange wooden ceiling greeted him in another man's skin, that felt like enough. The first morning after the first battle, he woke expecting the whole thing to have been some kind of fever dream from bad wine. It was not a dream. The bloodstains on his boots confirmed that much before his brain had even fully caught up with the previous night's decisions, Edwin brought him breakfast without asking a single question, which felt like the old butler's own quiet, careful way of showing loyalty. Richard ate every bite, realizing somewhere between the porridge and the bread that hunger, at least, translated perfectly across to entire lifetimes. He practiced drawing the family bow every single morning after that, not because the system needed it, but because his own hands did. Muscle memory only carried a man so far before actual repetition had to take over and finish the job properly. Galvin noticed the extra training and said nothing, which from a man who commented on absolutely everything, counted as its own kind of compliment. The recruits began copying his morning routine without being asked, until half the courtyard was drawing bows before the sun fully rose. He never once ordered that. It simply happened anyway, unasked. Leadership, he was slowly learning, worked less through commands and more through whatever example people actually chose to follow on. Their own. The orc workers in the mine adopted their own version of the routine, sharpening tools at dawn instead of drawing bows, same discipline either way. Grash reported it once, almost proudly, as though his tribe's willingness to match human habits somehow proved something important about survival itself. Richard agreed, though he suspected the real lesson was simpler. Everyone in this territory now understood exactly what waited for the unprepared. Winter storms rolled through twice that season, burying the roads and forcing every supply run into a careful, patient waiting game. He used the downtime to review every system menu properly, discovering upgrade paths he had missed entirely during the earlier scramble to survive. Some units, it turned out, could specialize further with the right resources, a discovery that kept him awake calculating possibilities long past midnight. Marco arrived with news of southern grain prices dropping, a small mercy that stretched the territory's dwindling reserves a few precious weeks further. The refugees, now settled properly, began contributing more than gratitude, offering skills nobody had thought to ask about during the initial chaos. A former baker turned out to be running half the castle's kitchen within a month, quietly, efficiently, without anyone formally appointing her to the role. He learned to recognize competence quickly and reward it faster, a habit that paid dividends far beyond anything the system ever tracked directly. The blacksmith apprentice program grew from one drunk dwarf to 3 human trainees within a season, hammering out simple tools under careful supervision. Every small industry rebuilding itself felt like its own tiny victory, stacking quietly on top of the louder, bloodier ones everyone actually remembered. He started keeping a private ledger of his own, separate from Marco's official one, tracking not coin, but simply who was still alive. That number mattered more to him some nights than any experience total the system ever bothered proudly displaying across his vision. The castle gained a proper healer eventually, an old woman from the refugee camp who mixed herbs with a skill nobody had expected to find there. She never asked why soldiers healed faster than her own remedies could explain, and he decided that was another mystery best left politely unexamined. Children born that winter arrived into a territory that, for the first time in years, actually had enough food to properly welcome them. He held one briefly at a naming ceremony, awkward and terrified, and understood suddenly why his own father had fought so hard to protect this place. That single, quiet moment taught him more about the weight of this title than any throne room ceremony ever managed to convey. Baron was not a reward, he realized standing there, it was simply a promise, renewed every single day whether he felt ready or not. He kept that promise through storms, through debt, through orc horns sounding in the dark, because the alternative was simply unthinkable now. Somewhere along the way, without noticing exactly when, he had stopped thinking of this world as a nightmare and started calling it home. The realization surprised him more than any system notification ever had, quiet, undramatic, arriving somewhere between one battle and the next. He did not mention it to anyone, not even Royce, choosing instead to simply let the feeling settle into his bones like the cold always did. Home, a word reclaimed fully, a word he had not expected to mean anything again, spoken quietly to himself on a wall overlooking mountains that wanted him dead. And yet, standing there, Frostworn humming softly against his hip, he found he meant it completely, without a single trace of irony left. The territory grew stronger through the winter, wall by wall, harvest by harvest, alliance by careful, hard-won alliance. Every threat that arrived taught him something new about the system, about his own limits, about exactly how far stubbornness could carry a man. He stopped counting the days since waking up under that strange wooden ceiling, deciding the number mattered less than what he had built since. The Starfaller title stuck permanently now, carved quietly into the territory's own growing legend. Whether history books ever bothered recording the true origin or not, he liked it that way. Let them wonder about it. Let the mountains keep their secrets, and let him keep his. Guarded carefully behind a smile that no longer felt entirely fake. Snow fell again that night, soft and steady, and for once it felt less like a warning and more like simple, ordinary weather. He allowed himself that small mercy, standing on the wall a moment longer than strictly necessary, watching flakes disappear into torchlight below. Tomorrow would bring new problems. It always did, without fail. But tonight, at least, the castle was quiet, the fires were warm, and the man once known only as a drunken disappointment finally slept. The scars on his cheek from Redmond's dagger never fully faded, a small, permanent reminder of exactly how close that duel had actually come. He caught himself touching it sometimes during quiet meetings, an unconscious habit that Royce noticed but never once mentioned out loud. Frostworn's runes had grown brighter since that fight, feeding on every battle since like a creature slowly waking up piece by piece. He wondered occasionally what the blade would look like a decade from now, fully grown into whatever legend it was clearly building toward. That thought excited him more than it frightened him, which probably said something concerning about how thoroughly this world had changed him already. The Dwarf Forge produced its first batch of registered bloodsteel swords that winter, exactly 10, precisely as promised to the crown. Graham complained the entire time about wasting real craftsmanship on royal paperwork, instead of proper legendary work, but finished every single blade anyway. Richard sent the shipment south with an honor guard large enough to discourage bandits, and small enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention. The king's reply arrived weeks later, brief, formal, and unmistakably pleased. Exactly the kind of quiet approval that kept a border baron safe. He filed that letter carefully alongside the others, building a paper trail of loyalty that would matter enormously if the prince ever moved openly. The prince had gone quiet since Redmond's death, a silence Richard trusted about as much as he trusted a sleeping frostwolf. Ethel warned him once that quiet enemies were simply patient ones, and he took that warning more seriously than most advice he had received. He doubled the castle's watch rotation anyway, just in case patience eventually ran out somewhere south of the mountains he actually controlled. Grash's warriors adapted to sentry duty faster than anyone expected, treating the assignment with a seriousness that quietly impressed even Royce. The Bloodscar tribe, once a threat, had become something closer to family, an outcome nobody in that first desperate week could have predicted. He thought about that transformation often. Orcs and humans standing shoulder to shoulder on walls that used to separate them completely. Maybe that was the real legacy building here. Not gold, not territory, but proof that old hatreds could bend when survival demanded it enough. He was not naive enough to think that peace was permanent, but he let himself hope it might at least outlast his own lifetime. The system never commented on hope. It only tracked cold numbers. He decided that was fine, because some things were worth building even when nothing was watching to reward the effort. Properly, Snow Eagle Castle stood taller each season, stone by stone, alliance by alliance, and Richard Schwing stood right there with it. He thought about Frostworn's growth trait constantly, wondering exactly what threshold might unlock its next hidden ability someday. The system stayed silent on that question, as it always did, offering hints instead of answers whenever real curiosity actually mattered. He decided that mystery suited the blade fine, since a weapon that explained itself completely probably was not much of a legend at all. Grundon swore the blade whispered sometimes late at night in the forge, though Graham dismissed that claim as pure dwarven nonsense and sheep ale. Richard never confirmed or denied it, mostly because some mornings, quietly, he genuinely was not sure himself anymore. The castle's bell tower gained a new addition that winter, a watch post specifically built to spot smoke signals from the farthest villages. Royce insisted on testing it personally every single week, refusing to trust any system built on someone else's careless assumptions about safety. That caution had already saved lives once, and Richard had stopped arguing with anything that kept his people breathing another day. He caught himself, more than once, genuinely enjoying the rhythm of running a territory instead of merely surviving at one crisis at a time. That shift felt earned, hard-won across every battle, every debt, every impossible night the castle somehow refused to fall. The Starfaller was not a myth anymore. He was simply the man who kept showing up, blade drawn, system humming, ready for whatever the mountains sent next. The grain merchant who once overcharged him now sent honest prices unprompted. Terrified word of that first negotiation might spread further south. Marco kept that reputation alive deliberately, understanding that fear of fair dealing was sometimes more valuable than fear of an actual army. Richard let him run trade however he saw fit, since results mattered more than methods in a territory this desperate for stability. The river route Marco discovered became the territory's lifeline by midwinter. Boats gliding past the iron mine loaded with grain and returning with ore. Old Captain Co., hired that same afternoon in the market, turned out to be worth every coin paid for his stubborn, reliable fleet. Richard rarely thanked people directly, preferring instead to simply keep them paid, housed, and useful, which most seemed to appreciate just as much. Loyalty, he had learned fast, grew faster from consistency than from grand speeches nobody actually remembered past the following morning anyway. The castle's granary, empty on the day he first arrived, stayed reliably full through the coldest stretch of that entire brutal winter. He checked the stores personally sometimes, just to remind himself how far this crumbling ruin had actually come. Since that first desperate morning, every full sack felt like a small argument won against the version of this world that had wanted his family erased completely. He was still winning that argument, one battle, one harvest, one stubborn refusal to give up at a time. He thought back sometimes to that first morning, the blacksmith's hammer of a headache, the wrinkled stranger weeping with relief above him. That version of himself, hungover and terrified, would never have believed any of what came after was even remotely possible. Yet here he stood anyway, sword humming, castle standing, an entire strange world slowly learning to call him lord without irony. He decided that was the strangest victory of all, stranger than any battle, stranger than any legendary blade forged beneath his own floor. Not survival exactly, but belonging, earned the hard way. In a life he never asked for and would not trade back now. Frostworm pulsed once against his hip, warm, patient, and completely, unmistakably his, exactly as it had promised the night it first accepted his name. Somewhere south, a prince still plotted, patient and furious, waiting for the right moment to move against a baron he could not yet touch. Richard knew that reckoning was coming eventually, later, on ground and terms he intended to choose for himself when it finally arrived. For now, the mountains stayed quiet, the forge stayed warm, and Snow Eagle Castle stood exactly where it had always stood, unbroken. That would have to be enough for tonight. It was, entirely, completely so. Somewhere in the dark, wolves called again, and this time nobody inside those walls flinched at the sound anymore. They had heard far worse. They had survived far worse. And standing on the wall, Frostworm glowing softly in the cold, Richard Schwing finally, completely believed they always would. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the cold wind carry away everything the day had cost him. Tomorrow there would be new reports, new threats, new numbers scrolling silently behind his eyes. Tonight there was only snow, torchlight, and a castle that had finally, truly earned its own survival. He turned from the wall and walked back inside, boots echoing against stone that no longer felt borrowed. This was his home now, entirely, completely, without a single doubt left standing anywhere in his chest. He set Frostworm against the wall beside his bed, runes dimming slowly into a quiet, patient sleep. Outside, the last torch on the wall flickered once and steadied against the wind. Snow kept falling, soft and endless, over a territory that finally belonged to him. The Starfaller closed his eyes. For the first time in this entire world, he slept without a single nightmare.